Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to start with a poll. The first question is, has your organisation been impacted by a supply chain disruption at any point in the last 2 years? Hands up. I see a few hands. Anybody not been impacted by a supply chain disruption? Any hands? Okay, don't see any. I was going to say lucky you if you haven't. Second question, are you fed up hearing about supply chain disruptions and just wish they'd all go away? Hands up. I hear a few raised voices, a few hands. Okay, I've got bad news for you, I'm afraid. It doesn't look like that's going to happen anytime soon. And actually, if it did, my company probably wouldn't have a business model. I probably wouldn't have a job, and I certainly wouldn't be here talking to you about this today. In the last 4 years, we have had the US-China trade war, tariffs of up to 25%, restrictions on American companies selling technologies to the Chinese. Hasn't been resolved. No signs of that being resolved, despite a change of American administration. We've, of course, had a global pandemic, COVID-19. That hasn't gone away either. And in China, over the last couple of months, we've seen extensive lockdowns in cities like Shenzhen, the heart of the tech industry, in Shanghai, and elsewhere in the country. People, obviously affecting people can't get to work, factories can't run, ships can't be loaded in ports, and, that is also ongoing. So major disruption to many global supply chains as a result of that. Also, as a result of the pandemic, we've had severe semiconductor shortages, also continuing, affecting all sorts of products, including cars. If anyone has tried to order a new car in the last 6 to 9 or 12 months, you're probably still waiting for it, depending on which brand you've tried to buy. And then last year, of course, we had the Ever Given, one of the world's biggest container ships, blocking the Suez Canal for a whole week, with many hundreds of ships backed up and not exactly helping all of the other problems that have been going on. And then, of course, most recently, since February the 24th, we've had Russia's invasion of Ukraine, war in Ukraine, devastated the country, displaced about 7 million refugees across Europe and elsewhere. It's led to severe shortages of foodstuffs like corn, wheat, sunflower oil, which is obviously having an impact here as well. It's pushed up the cost of oil and gas and many other metal products like nickel, palladium, and so on, titanium. So, all huge disruptions in the way that supply chains are operating. So what I want to do in this session is really kind of cover these 4 points. We'll talk a little bit about the supply chain risk problem. We'll talk about why some traditional approaches are not actually helping to solve that problem. Then I'll give you a bit of an insight into how we at Interos view a different kind of solution. And then finally, just very quickly, some of the business benefits of taking this different approach. And then hopefully we'll have a minute or two for Q&A at the end. So let's start with the problem. This is how supply chain disruptions have sort of typically been classified. So you plot them on this matrix. You've got frequency against business impact. In the top right-hand red quadrant, we have what sort of known risks that happen quite often and have high business impact. Those in supply chain circles, in risk circles, are often known as the grey rhinos. So that would include things like, big factory fires, major cyber attacks, that type of risk event. In the bottom right-hand corner, we have unknown risks that don't happen very often, or never used to happen very often, are catastrophic in impact. The reason those are orange is because it's very hard to know when those are going to happen and where in the world, so we tend to sort of put them to one side and just focus on what we know about and can actually influence. Those events are what are called black swans. So that would include things like global pandemics, massive earthquakes like the one we saw in Japan just over 10 years ago, other kind of major climatic events. However, what with everything I've said that's been happening over the last few years, really the distinction between grey rhinos and black swans is kind of blurring. And many supply chain leaders are trying to grapple with multiple overlapping disruptions coming from different sources, different risk events, different parts of the world. And so this idea that we have this nice steady state where everything works very smoothly, and then just once in a while we have a black swan event that we all have to scramble and try and fix, and then we quickly go back to normal. That idea at the moment is not holding the currency it once did, and many leading supply chain executives will tell you that they now expect the sort of constant disruption to be the new normal. So that's why we say, and that's why I put it in the title of the presentation, the black swan is dead. This is from a study we did in the first quarter of this year, 1,500 IT security and procurement professionals here across Europe and also in North America. They're in a number of different industry sectors, IT and technology, financial services, aerospace and defense, pharmaceuticals, and also central government. And fairly large organizations, over $1 billion in revenue. What you can see here is that on average, those executives told us that they'd experienced 3 significant supply chain disruptions in the past 12 months. 20% said it was 5 or more. Why is that a problem? Well, of course, these events cause problems with supply availability. They extend lead times, and ultimately, in some cases, they cause delays to customer orders being fulfilled. Customers are disappointed, consumers are disappointed. It also has a cost impact because in some cases we have to scramble to try and buy raw materials, let's say on the spot market. We may have to expedite logistics, fly things from China rather than waiting for many weeks to put them on a container ship. We may have to close down some of our production lines for days at a time. We've seen that on many occasions over recent months in the automotive sector, for example. And in the retail sector, guess what? Companies like Walmart might actually fine you, penalize you as a goods supplier if your products don't turn up at the required time in the ordered quantity. So costly. On average in our study, the executives estimated that in the past 12 months, these supply chain disruptions have cost them $182 million, or 1.74% of annual turnover. So this 182 will be roughly representative for a $10 billion turnover company. So it can be expensive. Where do these disruptions come from? Again, the bad news is, and you can see less than a fifth happen at the first tier of our supply chain. That means companies we directly contract with, directly buy from and order from. But as you look down the chart, you can see as we go further back in the supply chain, tier 2, our suppliers, tier 3, the suppliers, and so on, back up into the network, actually the disruptions increase. So 3/4 of our sample actually said they'd experienced significant supply chain disruptions happening below tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, tier 5, and so on. Why is that a problem? Well, at the moment, most organizations don't have the visibility, or they don't have good visibility below that tier 2 level. Here's an example. In this case, we're talking about a supplier experiencing a geopolitical event that's caused them some kind of disruption. Could be the war in Ukraine. And you can see on the left-hand side, so 52%, so they would only have confidence, they would know about that event in any kind of reasonable period of time if it happened at tier 1 or tier 2. But as I say, 3/4 of our sample saying they've experienced disruptions below tier 2. So there's a gap, there's a mismatch there. This is an example of geopolitical turmoil, but it will be the same for supplier financial problems, cyber attacks, operational issues, or ESG violations somewhere in your extended supply network. Here's an example. This is some data we modeled from Interos' global relationship mapping platform, taking the example of Taiwanese semiconductors. And you can see if I build this out, Tier 1 is actually relatively low numbers connected to the major Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturers. As you get to Tier 2, we get into the tens of thousands of connections and interdependencies. As we get to Tier 3, it gets into the hundreds of thousands. Companies like TSMC, which completely dominate the semiconductor manufacturing market, are typically at Tiers 3 or even maybe Tiers 4. So the question here is, if China were to invade Taiwan, as many people fear, would you actually know about these dependencies that your company had on these particular manufacturers, and would you know about it quickly enough to actually be able to do anything about it? So that's really the challenge. Taiwan dominates the market for these products, particularly advanced chips. So, operational resilience, what do we mean by that? Essentially, it is about being much more proactive, much more strategic, and being able to get ahead of risk events and disruptions as best you possibly can. This is how we define it at Interos. It's not just about mitigating the negative impact of disruptions I've already talked about. It's also, in some cases, being able to, to gain market share or to gain customer orders because you're able to move faster than your rivals. Now, in order to do that, supply chain leaders, risk leaders really need to do three things. They need to be able to map their supply chains, not just at the Tier 1 direct relationship level, but at that sub-tier level. They need to be able to model risks. They need to be able to identify them, pinpoint where the highest risks are, and then take some kind of mitigating action in those cases where it's possible. And then finally, they need to be able to monitor events on a sort of a real-time or near real-time basis. The days where you could just collect some information on a spreadsheet, put it on a shelf, and then not worry too much about it are gone. If you're going to keep up with what's going on in the world right now, you have to be able to monitor your supply chains and your suppliers continuously. So let's just talk about the traditional approach to trying to cope with this. I'll just give you a couple of examples. The first one is, in order to try and map that supply chain, you conduct some kind of supplier survey. So you send the survey to your suppliers, you wait for a period of time. If you're lucky, maybe a quarter of them respond and give you some information. And guess what? Even if they do, in many cases, they're going to say, yeah, we're all fine, we don't have risks, we've got everything covered, we're not going to be disrupted, and all is good. Now, this also brings in the idea that if you're asking your direct supplier to tell you who they do business with, who their suppliers are they going to give you that information just readily? Well, of course, in many cases, they're not. It's private, it's confidential. They worry about actually being cut out of the supply chain if you know who they're buying directly from. And so that is a huge area, a huge problem area when you're trying to build up this picture of your extended network. Some existing technology solutions actually build in lots of nice little survey tools which allow you very quickly to kind of send requests out to your supply base. But you're still going to have the same problems as to whether the companies you do business with are willing to share that kind of information. The second approach is to do a kind of consulting project. So you hire some expensive consultants, they go out, they talk to your suppliers, they maybe run surveys, they pick up the phone, they try and accumulate all this different information, and they build essentially a kind of a high-fidelity digital twin of, well, at least part of your supply chain. It may be for certain product lines or certain materials or components. But guess what? It's almost outdated as soon as they finish the work. And it certainly doesn't give you that ongoing monitoring capability that I mentioned. So again, not an easy solution to what is a complex problem. In our study, and you can't see the figure there, but only 11% of the 1,500 executives told us, yes, we can monitor supplier risks across our network on a continuous basis, real time, near real time. 3 quarters say we can do it either weekly, monthly, or quarterly. Is that good enough in the current environment to be able to handle the complexity and the number of different moving parts, the number of different risk events and problems? Well, we would say no, it's not. So just to kind of summarize then, the limitation of the traditional approach, heavily manual, whether you're trying to map your supply chain, whether you're trying to calculate risks, run supplier risk scorecards or other things. It's biased because the information is either subjective, it's coming from your suppliers, or internally, it may not be correct. It's outdated because it's not dynamic, it's very static. The time to value can be measured in many months, and it's costly. You've got multiple FTEs, you've got expensive consultants. So Interos came up with, a few years ago, with a different solution, and it's really essentially based on the idea that supply chain risk and visibility is a big data problem that requires a big data solution. Our solution, our platform, is based on the 3 things you see here: inexpensive or relatively inexpensive computing power and storage, abundant data in the supply chain area for training and inference. So that's a whole range of different sources, news channels, proprietary or commercial structured data sources, and many others. And then, of course, the cloud-based SaaS solutions are much more widely accepted than they used to be by large organizations. So our approach is to essentially use natural language programming. We have crawlers going out across the web to capture all these different sources of information on connections between companies, contract announcements, company financials, import-export relationships and things like that. And then on top of that, we have some quite complex statistical risk models that suck in that data layered on top of what the web crawlers do, and they take in, they have lots of different attributes and criteria for each of 6 major risk factors, so things like cybersecurity, financial health, ESG, circumstances, and so on. And these models are automated. They don't require people to sit there updating spreadsheets. They're automated, they're dynamic, they're trying to model based on current and historical events. I'll just show you three shots from our platform. This isn't actually a terribly good example, but you can imagine a large company with many suppliers, even at the first tier. This whole map will be absolutely covered with bubbles. The point is you can drill down to see where you have concentrations of supply in particular regions. So when Shanghai was locked down, our customers were able to use this to zoom into that area to see what tier 1 suppliers do we have, but also what tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers are in that area that we may not otherwise be aware of. This is something we call Galaxy. Our UX team have actually patented this, and it's really a kind of a graph visualization of complex supply chain data sets. So this can be used to do a number of things. It can show you exactly where a particular entity is in your broad ecosystem. So an example of that would be on Tuesday this week, the United States government introduced a law called the Uyga Forced Labor Act. That means that US companies are now no longer allowed to import products from China if they have got any component, raw material from the Xinjiang area of China that may be at risk of using forced labor from the Uyghur population. They issued a list of 20 major companies that they say are involved in that and are therefore restricted. Our customers will be able to go in using this to see, do we have any of those companies in our extended supply chain? The other thing, and you can see it kind of represented here, is it allows you to filter in many different ways, look at where are your highest risk suppliers. The point of risk management in supply chain is, for a large organization, you cannot cover all the bases. You have to be very precise, very targeted, and you need to be deliberate about where you're going to try and mitigate risk, for example, by qualifying an additional supplier, and where you're just going to accept the situation as it stands. So this is a kind of a graphical way of trying to make this much more intuitive for our users. And then finally, as in many SaaS solutions, dashboards that allow you to very quickly kind of drill in, see where those highest risk suppliers are, why they're graded as being highest risk in terms of those different risk factors, and then also the kind of the monitoring. So you can go right down to an individual company level, whether it's a tier 1, 2, or 3. You can see, are there any kind of news events affecting that company? Have they had a fire in one of their Asian manufacturing plants? Is there a takeover rumor? Has there been a sudden change of CEO or other senior executive? Has there been a cyber attack that's taken their operations down? Those types of events. Now, in our study, less than a fifth of executives told us, yes, we have that kind of advanced technology in place. 3/4 said we don't have it, or we haven't actually started using it yet, but we plan to introduce it in the last 12 months. I have to say these figures are generous. There are lots of different types of supply chain visibility solution out there with different use cases, not just supply chain risk and resilience. I would be surprised that I would actually expect these numbers to be a lot lower in terms of current adoption. And certainly those that are actually going to invest in these. Nevertheless, it just underlines how much of a critical problem this is to fix. So finally, some of the business benefits. Again, this is what our sample told us. So being able to kind of analyze risk, identify it, prioritize it, zoom in on it, and then to be able to look at, based on our kind of risk appetite as an organization, what can we actually do about it? Should we invest in some kind of workaround in advance? Not trying to react when some event's already happened and it's too late, but actually getting out ahead of these problems. More than half of the sample, to my point earlier, actually said that we see an opportunity here to get ahead of our competition by being quicker off the mark. And I think you can see that quote on the right-hand side. That sums it up perfectly. What we're trying to do is to be able to anticipate problems before they happen and get ahead of them. Because when we have these massive disruptive events, being able to kind of make quick decisions, being able to kind of go to your suppliers, being able to lock up supply, limited pool of labor, these kind of constraints, that can make the difference between you continuing to run your business and run your operations or having to shut them down for a period of time. And then just finally, a summary of hopefully the benefits that have come through. So much, using a kind of advanced AI, ML-based solution like the one that we've developed, much quicker time to value. You're not waiting months on end to try and get all this data in. It's kind of there instantly for you. You have continuous monitoring, always up-to-date information, and hopefully also lower costs. So it would be wrong to say that this technology is kind of widely adopted. This is really only coming in the last 3 or 4 years. There's still a lot of development to go on, but I think hopefully I've kind of illustrated that this is a major problem for many companies right now. And technology is not the full answer, but it certainly it can go quite a long way in helping you to get the data, the information, and the visibility across your global network in a way that you haven't been able to do before. So with that, thank you very much. Scott, do we have time for questions? Maybe just about.
If you've got time, we can make some time. Okay, thank you, Geraint. Just a couple of questions, actually. So the solution you're talking about here, the Interos solution, just to clarify, that does not require direct input from any of those lower tier suppliers. This is based on sourcing that information and data yourself and then using the software and everything else to interpret that.
Correct. So this is meant to give you a picture of your extended network without you actually having to do very much. Now, some of our customers, do they want to give us a list of their tier 1 suppliers as a kind of starting point? Yes, of course they do, and that's becoming a bigger part of the overall solution now. But the whole point of this is it's automated. It will not give you, it's a macro view of your network. It's not going to drill right down to a manufacturing bill of materials to say which supplier, which sub-tier supplier produces which individual part or produces which particular sub-assembly or contributes which particular part of the service. That may come in the future, but it at least gives you, rather than starting with a blank sheet or a blank screen, you now start with quite a rich picture that then you can actually zoom in. In some cases, you may need to validate, drill down to get more information. A lot of that is going to come through dialogue with suppliers, and that means you also have to have good, open, trusting relationships. So it's not purely about the technology, but we try and do a lot of that heavy lifting for you.
And of course, when you're looking into tier 3 and below as well, there is that element of looking for potential disruption to your business, but increasingly there's a need via regulation to make sure you're adhering to sustainability issues and guidelines. So this is something that would help with that sustainability effort as well.
Yeah, as I mentioned, ESG is one of the 6 risk factors we cover. One of the others is what we call restrictions. So that would include like the forced labor legislation I mentioned that came into the US this week. In Germany, I think from the beginning of next year, we've got the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, which is also beginning to mandate that you're collecting information about Scope 3 emissions, carbon emissions, but also issues around forced and child labour. So yeah, more legislation is coming onto the statute books. There'll be more over the next few years. That is forcing companies, as the conflict minerals legislation did in the US more than 10 years ago, to actually start to try and build up this more detailed picture of their supply chains. But just complying with the legislation is not the full story. The best companies, leading companies, in terms of managing risk, developing greater resilience, are going beyond that now.
Are you able to tell us any of those companies that you're working with?
I won't name any of our customers. We focus primarily on the financial services sector. We have a lot of big banks, the aerospace and defence sector, so both here in the UK and in the US, some of the major manufacturers, but also government agencies that are actually buying a lot of these products. We have a few clients in pharmaceuticals. Traditionally, I would say the leaders in supply chain risk management have been some of the big tech companies like Apple and Intel, some of the big automotive manufacturers would also be examples of that.
Okay, any questions from the room? Yes, we'll just take the one down here at the front, please. We'll just wait for the microphone, please, yeah. And if you can just say your name and what company you're from, please. Thank you.
My name is Mohamed Nsereko. The Member of Parliament for Kampala. And I'm
a Member of Parliament for Kampala?
Yes, Kampala Central.
Yeah.
And I came here in my own capacity. And I'm glad to be interfacing with the presenter who made a wonderful presentation. The solution that you're providing here is one of the most amazing that I've come across, because then it gives prediction, the predictive analytics. In my opinion, I can see that it can save governments a lot of money, but even companies. For example, if you can create a solution that can tell me if I own an airline company, when I have to refix the engines, and it predicts for me analytics, whether to fix them now, that would impact what I do as the decisions I take, probably in insurance, production, or even if we own, let's say, an airline, I would know whether there would be production in the next 7 years if it can tell me the disruptions that they are of. The issue now here is how expensive and how cheap is this solution? Because it's good, it's amazing, there is less human contact, there is no bias, and there are two things that I'm seeing here. One, the issue of confidentiality. Because when someone submits data to you, then they are submitting data that might affect national security. So where is the confidentiality here? So I can see something amazing, a solution that cuts down the red tape, and a solution in the good way. It could impact edutech, in education technology, a lot in biotech, a lot in production, but also in insurance tech. I would know how to insure in form of, let's say, the goods, what plans I would do, the Incoterms I would go to in the supply chain and trade. Therefore, please help us know how good it is by distinguishing, one, for government, two, for private players. How expensive would it be if a small person with a small business wants to come and use this program, and how it would help them so that we have inclusivity. It can show me the risk as the smallest player starting a small tech company, maybe in Chennai, in India, or in Africa, like we are, but to the biggest players, which would be governments, definitely.
Yeah.
That is what we'd like to know. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and you may have kind of discerned this when I said that our sample was companies over $1 billion in revenue, or obviously government agencies with significant spend. So, we could take like the United States Department of Defense, for example, which is one of our customers. So yeah, I mean, Interos has very much to this point been focused on big organizations. Our solution is as with any SaaS platform, it depends on how you're using it and what kind of features you want. But yeah, you're looking at kind of north of $100,000 a year, and some companies will go upwards from that. So yeah, we will probably develop sort of more mid-market SME type offerings. We haven't got those right now. I would also say you identified quite an interesting data challenge in terms of confidentiality. I'll give you an example of that. In the US, all import-export data is public. And so that's a major data source we use for our US-based companies to understand the relationships that they have with direct suppliers and then with those sub-tiers. In Europe, that information is currently private. So we're actually beginning sort of to get involved in kind of lobbying efforts with the UK government, with the EU, to say, look, if you're going to keep this important source of data private, there is a risk attached to that. How are we going to know that our companies are using child labour somewhere in Asia or forced labour in China, for example? So I think there are interesting emerging arguments around that. I would say to your first part of your question, our software doesn't tell you when your jet engine is about to break down. We do have major airlines, US airlines as customers, but they will use other software from the likes of GE, Rolls-Royce and others that will actually predict that. I think in supply chain risk terms, predictive analytics is sort of nascent, it's emerging. I think there are lots of good use cases, there are some interesting applications, but there's a lot more to come there in terms of helping us to, as I say, anticipate problems, get ahead of potential issues, using a lot of kind of algorithmic models, big data sources, historical data, and so on. So yeah, we build in some of that where we can into our risk modeling, but a lot more to come. And I think that's actually really exciting. That's what certainly supply chain executives tell us they will need in the future if circumstances like the ones we've been living through for the last few years continue.
Okay, thank you very much, Geraint. We're going to leave it there. If there's any more questions, you can ask them directly via the event app to Geraint. I'm sure he'll be happy to address any questions you have, or obviously reach out to him via LinkedIn as well. But for now, Geraint John, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just take that off you. Thank you, Geraint.